This is what happens when nursing programs lower their standards. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before Commander James Halifax's heart stopped for the first time. Katie Rodriguez moves through Seattle General's ICU in Philadelphia with hands that never shake, her scrubs crisp despite the 12-hour shift, checking for drips with precision that makes the other nurses look sloppy. The fluorescent lights hum above rows of monitors, antiseptic smell mixing with floor wax, cold steel bed rails catching reflections of ventilator screens. She pauses at the nurse's station to chart vitals, her left hand unconsciously touching the tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket, a habit she performs 6 times per shift when no one is watching. A faint scar runs along her right shoulder, visible when her collar shifts. Room for 47 holds Commander Halifax, Special Forces, medically induced coma following combat injuries, his chart flagged for neurological monitoring. Katie enters to check his central line, and for 3 seconds her fingers pause on his left forearm where her own name is tattooed in military stencil font. He doesn't know her. The morphine drip ensures he won't. Dr. Caldwell's footsteps echo in the corridor outside, his voice already rising as he begins afternoon rounds. The observation gallery fills with third-year medical students, their white coats still crisp from the laundry, eyes bright with the kind of eagerness that comes from having never been broken by reality. Katie hears him before she sees him, his presence announced like an approaching storm, the kind that darkens the sky 3 minutes before the first rain falls. She continues charting, her pen moving across the clipboard with mechanical steadiness, documenting O2 saturation, heart rate variability, the precise angle of the ventilator tube. Her jaw tightens. Imperceptibly. The kind of clench that takes 17 years of discipline to make invisible. Caldwell sweeps into the ICU with his entourage, 3 residents trailing behind him like pilot fish following a shark. He is tall, silver-haired, the kind of man whose suits cost more than most nurses make in a week. His stethoscope hangs around his neck like a medal he won in a war nobody remembers, and his voice carries the particular cruelty of someone who has never experienced consequences. He stops at room for 47, Halifax's room, and speaks loud enough for the gallery windows to catch every word. This is what happens, he says, gesturing toward Katie without looking at her, when we lower admission standards to fill quotas. Substandard care. Sloppy technique. And unfortunately, some of our patients pay the price. The medical students lean forward. One of them actually smirks. Katie's hand does not tremble. Her pen does not pause. She documents the last vital sign and moves to the next monitor, her movement steady as a surgical laser, each gesture precise and economical. The scar on her shoulder, the one from a 7.62 round that missed her spine by 14 millimeters in margin, does not visibly tense. She has been insulted by men with actual power. By commanders who could have her court-martialed with 3 words. By enemies who had her pinned in a compound while rounds shredded the concrete 6 inches from her head. A hospital doctor's contempt registers with approximately the same emotional weight as a fly landing on a window pane. Caldwell continues. Notice the 4 placement, he says, and Katie knows without turning that he is pointing at her work from the 6 a.m. shift. Adequate. But not excellent. Not what we would expect from someone with proper training. He says this while looking at the 4, a perfect 18-gauge angiocath needle, placed on the first stick, secured with sterile technique, positioned at an angle that will allow for medication infusion without infiltration. The site is textbook. The placement is flawless. But textbook and flawless do not carry the weight of his opinion, and his opinion is all that matters in this building. Katie moves to chart station B and begins entering medication times into the electronic system. Her fingers move across the keyboard with the kind of rhythm that comes from doing the same motion 400 times. She does not look at Caldwell. She does not acknowledge the gallery. She does not perform hurt or anger or wounded pride. This is her composure style, not the kind that comes from believing she deserves better treatment, but the kind that comes from understanding that her reaction is the only power she has, and she will not give it to him. She will not give any of them satisfaction. The trembling that wants to happen, the kind born from 17 years of compartmentalization and military training, stays locked inside, and she channels it instead into the precise, efficient movements of a woman who has held dying people together with her own hands and has no tolerance for theatre. The observation gallery watches. Caldwell finishes his comment and moves on to the next patient, his voice already launching into a lecture about fluid balance protocols. Katie continues working. She enters vital sign data. She checks oxygen saturation on 3 patients. She adjusts a ventilator alarm that has been triggering false positives, the kind of small clinical decision that a nurse with proper training would make automatically, and that Caldwell will later claim to have discovered himself. The ICU hums around her. The monitors beep their steady rhythm. Somewhere down the corridor, a code cart is being restocked by someone who has never had to use one to save a life. And then the thought hits, not for the first time, but harder this time, he has no idea who is standing in this room. That is what happens when you judge based on what you can see. Caldwell sees a young woman in blue scrubs, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, a hospital ID badge dangling from a lanyard that cost $3. He sees someone who works the night shift and rarely speaks and never contradicts him. What he does not see is the Master Chief Petty Officer who spent for months training SEAL platoons in advanced field medicine. What he does not see are the hands that performed emergency open chest procedures in a compound in Marja with nothing but a trauma kit and the knowledge that the man on the table had her name tattooed on his left forearm and would die if she stopped moving. What he does not see is someone who has held rank in an organization that makes hospital hierarchies look like children playing at authority. Katie's orders came through official channels 3 weeks ago. Director level. The kind of orders that come from people who don't say please or explain their reasoning. Her nursing credentials are real, she has earned every certification, passed every exam, maintained every license. But her presence at Seattle General is not coincidental. Her assignment is to monitor Commander James Halifax, unit commander from SEAL Team 3, currently sedated in room for 47 with injuries sustained during a classified operation in hostile territory. He has been in the ICU for 8 days. His medical chart shows combat trauma, but nothing that explains why he was transferred here instead of Walter Reed. Why a young nurse with no apparent background was specifically requested to monitor his case. Why his room has a red flag on the patient board that means restricted information and report any visitors immediately. The last time Katie saw Commander Halifax's face was not through a medication-induced haze. It was 3 years ago in Marja, during Operation Enduring Freedom, when her unit was pinned down in the Joland district and Halifax's SEAL team came in to extract them. She was shot twice that day, once in the shoulder, once below the ribs. The second one was close to things that were supposed to stay inside. Halifax carried her 3 miles through hostile territory while rounds cracked the air around them like whips. He did not set her down. He did not hesitate. He did not stop moving until they reached the extraction point, and by that time her blood had soaked through his entire left side and she was halfway to shock. He stayed with her until the medics took over. 6 months later, when she was cleared for duty, she found out he had gotten her name tattooed on his left forearm. The tattoo was done in military stencil font. The kind that is permanent. The kind that means something. Now he is in room for 47, sedated, with no memory of her. The morphine drip is heavy enough to keep him unconscious, supposedly for pain management, though Katie's orders mention nothing about pain. They mention monitoring, observation, and immediate notification if his condition changes. They mention that she is the only authorized nurse for his case during night shifts. They mention nothing about what she is supposed to be watching for, which suggests it is something she will recognize when she sees it. They mention nothing about the 3 officers who called her personal cell phone, the number that is listed under a false name, to verify her clearance. They mention nothing about the challenge coin. That night, at 11:27 p.m., Katie sits in her studio apartment in a neighborhood where the rent is cheap and the neighbors don't ask questions. The apartment is sparse. Single bed. Kitchenette. A bookshelf with medical textbooks and paperbacks. No photos. No personal items. No evidence of the person she actually is. She holds the challenge coin in her left hand, turning it over and over, the metal cool against her palm. The coin is tarnished from 3 years of being carried in field gear, and the lettering is worn in places where hands have rubbed it smooth. One side bears the emblem of SEAL Team 3. The other side bears her own call sign, a name she has not been called in civilian life, a name that belongs to a different version of herself. The version that was a warrior instead of a nurse. The version that did not have to smile politely when doctors called her substandard. She turns the coin over in the dark apartment, the only light coming from the street lamps outside her window, and thinks about what Caldwell said. What happens when nursing programs lower their standards? The words settle in her chest, and she does not feel hurt by them because hurt requires vulnerability, and she has already given up the right to be vulnerable the day she signed her first classification agreement. Instead, she feels something colder. Something like the recognition that her cover is working perfectly. Nobody suspects her. Nobody questions her credentials. Nobody imagines that the quiet nurse who checks for lines and charts vitals is sitting on a military assignment that she cannot speak about. The best disguise is the truth wearing a different name. The challenge coin catches the light from the street. She has allowed herself to keep exactly one artifact from her real life. One piece of evidence that Captain James Halifax once knew her. One reminder that she is not actually Katie Rodriguez, just a nurse, the kind that doctors like Caldwell dismiss without thinking. She is someone else entirely. But Caldwell doesn't know that. And that, she realizes as she turns the coin over one more time before closing her fist around it, is exactly how it is supposed to be. Her phone buzzes. A text from an unknown number, the kind that uses burner apps and disappears after 48 hours. It reads, "Status on Halifax." She responds in 3 words, "Stable." No change. The text deletes itself immediately. And then she sits in the dark with her hand steady and her heart rate controlled, thinking about what happens when you underestimate someone because of the uniform they wear. Her hand is steady. The coffee doesn't ripple. That evening during shift change, Caldwell stops her at the nurse's station in front of 4 colleagues. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical rhythm overhead as he leans into her space, voice sharp enough to cut. "Rodriguez, did you adjust Commander Halifax's sedation rate?" She did, based on battlefield trauma patterns she can't explain knowing, on muscle memory from field medicine in compounds she can't name, on instinct that runs deeper than any protocol manual. "I documented a recommendation, Doctor." The words come out measured, professional. Deferential. The mask sits perfectly in place. A recommendation. He says it like she suggested leeches. His smile is predatory, designed for the audience of nurses pretending to work. "Let me be clear, you execute orders. You don't think. Every time you play doctor, you remind me why I opposed hiring you." His tone is casual, conversational, the way you'd comment on the weather. That's what makes it worse. The precision of it. His weaponizing every word, turning her competence into a liability, her military bearing into arrogance she doesn't possess. The other nurse's eyes flick toward her, then away. Nobody wants to be next. Katie's face shows nothing. She nods once, returns to her charting, fingers steady on the keyboard as her patient's vitals scroll across the screen. Her hands don't shake. Her breathing doesn't change. She feels the weight of Caldwell's stare for 3 more seconds, then he drifts away, satisfied. He got no reaction. He was hunting for cracks and found none. But that's not satisfaction enough for a man like him. That's just the appetizer. The next morning, Katie arrives at Seattle General at 05 for 5 hours, military time, old habit, and heads straight to the staff locker room on the 3rd floor. Her mailbox is institutional gray, standard issue, mounted in a row of 30 identical boxes. Inside, a formal performance review request on hospital letterhead, dated yesterday, signed by the nursing director. Her stomach doesn't drop. She's been briefed on worse. But the words registered in black ink feel like coordinates being marked on a map of her life. Repeated protocol concerns, it reads. Inappropriate clinical suggestions. Pattern of questioning physician directives. 14 instances documented. 14. He's been counting. Caldwell has been keeping a list, writing down every moment she saved a patient's life by anticipating what the doctors couldn't see, every suggestion based on scars she carries and wars she survived. 14 instances of her being right, catalogued as insubordination. Patricia Chen, the nursing director, calls her into the office by 0800. The office is small, window overlooking the parking garage, and Patricia sits behind her desk with her hands folded, the universal gesture of administrative apology. Katie, Dr. Caldwell has documented 14 instances of you questioning his orders. Her voice is apologetic but firm, the tone of someone who knows the rules and understands you're about to be crushed by them. He's asking for a competency evaluation. Patricia slides a folder across the desk. Inside, the 14 documented moments. Every medication suggestion. Every protocol deviation. Every time Katie had trusted her hands more than she trusted the chain of command. He's also contacted your nursing school references. I need you to understand, he has the board president on speed dial. He can make this very difficult. Katie sits motionless, hands folded in her lap, her posture a study in compliance. I understand. Her voice is quiet. Deferential. The voice of a nurse who knows her place. The voice of someone with nothing to hide and nothing to lose, except the one thing she came here to protect. But that wasn't the worst part. By 0930, while Katie is running fours on the cardiac floor, her personal email pings. Subject line, records request, nursing licensure verification. The sender is an investigator from the state licensing board. They're requesting her personnel file, her training transcripts, her certification documentation, her entire employment history. The email is professional and thorough. It's also a weapon that Caldwell has just loaded and fired. He called. He said something. The exact words don't matter. What matters is that the machinery of institutional authority is now spinning, and Katie Rodriguez, whoever that person claims to be, is in its path. She stands in the break room holding her phone, staring at the email, and her heart rate doesn't elevate. This is what you train for. This is the moment where the mission either holds or it doesn't. This is where you compartmentalize fear and convert it into data. Pain is information. Fear is information. An investigation into her identity is information that tells her exactly how serious Caldwell has become, how far he's willing to escalate, how much institutional power he's willing to burn just to prove he was right about her being a liability. She was placed at Seattle General specifically to monitor Halifax. Intelligence suggested a security breach in his SEAL Team 3 unit. Someone had leaked the location of a classified operation that got 3 of his men killed. Halifax had been flagged as a person of interest, though not a suspect. Keeping him alive, keeping him safe, keeping him under observation in the ICU until he could identify the breach was critical. The mission wasn't to befriend him. It wasn't to save him. It was to watch him. To listen. To be present when the assassins came. But that was before he crashed. That was before she looked at his vitals and knew, not assumed, knew, that his medication was wrong, that his sedation rate was going to mask a secondary infection, that the protocol was written for textbook cases and Halifax's body was anything but textbook. She made a recommendation. She was right. And being right had made her a threat to the man holding the authority to destroy her. That night in her studio apartment on the corner of Spruce and 22nd, Katie sits on the floor with her back against the bed, her legs stretched out in front of her, and she pulls the challenge coin from the small cardboard box she keeps in the back of her closet. It's tarnished bronze, heavy, the kind of weight that comes from being carried through dust storms and rubble and the kind of fear that has a pulse. The engraving reads MARSOC 2nd Battalion. On the reverse, 2 dates, 17 months apart. The beginning and the end of a deployment that changed everything. Halifax gave it to her in Marja, in a compound that was supposed to be secure but wasn't, 3 hours before the ambush that would scatter their unit across 3 different kill zones. He pressed it into her palm with his calloused fingers and said her name like a prayer. Like a promise. Like he was leaving her with something that mattered. She sets the coin on the windowsill, watches streetlights catch the tarnished bronze, watch it throw shadows across the hardwood floor. The city hums outside, sirens in the distance, the mechanical thrum of the vending machine in the apartment building below, wind against the brick facade. Katie doesn't turn on the lights. She doesn't sleep either. By 1000 the next morning, she watches Caldwell on his phone outside the ICU on the second floor, his body language animated, one hand pointing toward her through the glass. He's on the offensive now. He's making calls. The strategic phase has begun. Social humiliation wasn't enough. Now he's activating the apparatus. Now he's bringing in allies, setting traps, documenting every moment so that when this reaches an official hearing, his version of events will already be embedded in the record. The irony is exquisite. He's trying to discredit her by proving she makes clinical decisions without authorization. He doesn't understand that every recommendation she made was based on 15 years of field medicine, on survival training, on the kind of clinical experience that comes from holding someone's life together in conditions that would make a hospital ICU look like a luxury resort. He's documenting her competence as if it's a crime. An email arrives by 1100 from the state investigator with a follow-up request. 2 days for the personnel file. Katie forwards it to the nursing director's office with no comment. She changes her password. She reviews her cover documentation, the nursing degree from a legitimate program that was actually completed, the references who know to expect this call because they're former assets themselves, the references who will confirm that Katie Rodriguez is exactly what her resume claims to be. The mission is fracturing. She was placed here to observe. To report. To keep Halifax alive until someone higher up figured out who in his unit was compromised. But you can't observe when the observer is being hunted. You can't maintain cover when the most powerful person in the building has decided you're a threat. Blowing her cover means extraction. The Pentagon doesn't leave assets in hostile territory once they're burned. Extraction means a helicopter, means a ride to Langley or Fort Bragg or wherever they house people who know too much. Extraction means leaving Halifax vulnerable. It means the mission fails. It means that whatever threat exists in his unit will still exist, and Halifax will still be exposed. She can't leave him. That's the problem that keeps her awake for 36 hours straight. That's the problem that sits with her at the vending machine, that follows her through shift change, that hovers over her like a physical presence. She came here with one objective and it was simple: watch. Don't interfere. Don't get close. Maintain distance. But you can't watch someone for 3 weeks without seeing them. You can't hear their screams during sedation nightmares without wanting to intervene. You can't hold their vitals in your hands without caring whether they live or die. And you definitely can't save them, actually save them, bring them back from the edge, without creating a connection that transcends the mission parameters. The challenge coin sits on her windowsill under the streetlight. She reaches for it sometimes. Doesn't pick it up. Just touches the edge of it, cold bronze against her fingertips, remembering what his voice sounded like before the deployment, remembering what his laugh sounded like, remembering how he looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that made sense. But that was Marja. That was before. That was a person he doesn't even know exists anymore. The monitors began their gentle warning at 11 o'clock. Not alarms yet, just soft electronic whispers that meant something was sliding sideways. Katie stood 3 feet from Commander Halifax's bed in the ICU, watching his vital signs drift across the screen like a ship losing its heading. Blood pressure 94/58 and dropping. Heart rate climbing toward 115, the rhythm fracturing into premature ventricular contractions that looked like lightning on the telemetry strip. Oxygen saturation 87% despite the ventilator pushing air into his lungs at a steady mechanical rhythm. She'd seen this pattern before, not in textbooks, but in field hospitals in Marja where the morphine was running out and the wounded couldn't tell you what was breaking inside. Dr. Caldwell's medication protocol was suffocating him. The sedation dosage was too high, masking the body's distress signals, the same way a heavy blanket muffles a fire alarm. Halifax's cardiac system was screaming and nobody was listening because the drugs had turned down the volume. Katie's hands moved across his chart, fingers tracing the medication entries, calculating dosages in her head the way she'd calculated blood loss and shock ratios in desert compounds where there was no pharmacy, only what you knew and what you prayed would work. The vasopressor support was inadequate. The fentanyl levels were crushing his compensatory mechanisms. This wasn't incompetence, it was a protocol written by someone who'd never seen what happens when a body breaks after trauma. She reached for the phone at 11:02 p.m. Caldwell didn't answer the first page. The second page came back with a text, "Not available. Handle it yourself, Rodriguez," which meant he was somewhere in the hospital avoiding her, the way he'd avoided every suggestion she'd made for the past 72 hours. The third page 30 minutes later brought him to the ICU in a Navy sport coat that probably cost more than her monthly rent, his face already dark with irritation before she opened her mouth. "What is it, Rodriguez?" His voice carried that particular edge of a man who believed his time was too valuable to spend on nurses. She showed him the telemetry. She showed him the vitals. She kept her voice level, clinical, deferential. "His sedation is masking early septic shock. I think we need to reduce the fentanyl and start a norepinephrine infusion." Not demanding. Not insisting. Just a quiet suggestion from someone who knew how to survive alone in situations where medicine came from memory and desperation. Caldwell's jaw tightened. She saw it happen in real time, the moment he heard not a nursing concern but a challenge to his authority. "You're questioning my treatment plan? Again?" He turned to the resident standing beside Halifax's bed, a young man named Chen who suddenly found his shoes very interesting. "Document that Nurse Rodriguez is interfering with physician orders. I want her removed from this patient's care team immediately." Not a discussion. A command delivered like he was executing a warrant. "Ms. Rodriguez, your assignment to Commander Halifax's care has been terminated. Report to the surgical ward for reassignment. Effective now." The resident's pen scratched against paper. The sound was louder than it should have been. By 1 o'clock in the morning, a nursing supervisor named Williams was posted outside Halifax's door with explicit instructions: "Katie Rodriguez is not to enter this room. Not for vitals, not for medication reconciliation, not for any reason." Williams was competent and kind and completely under Caldwell's boot heel, which meant she would enforce the boundary with genuine regret but absolute firmness. Katie watched from the surgical ward hallway as the monitors kept climbing, as Caldwell adjusted medications that made everything worse, pushing more sedation into a man whose body was trying to tell him the original protocol was killing him. The other nurses whispered to each other in the break room. They'd seen her work. They knew her suggestions were right. But contradicting Caldwell meant career reviews and mysterious schedule changes and the slow strangulation of professional reputation, so they stayed quiet and adjusted drips according to protocol and let a man die by the book. At 1:47 in the morning, Katie made a choice that would burn everything down. The break room was empty. Williams had gone to the bathroom on the second floor. Katie had watched her leave, had waited exactly 90 seconds, had moved toward Halifax's room like muscle memory taking over, like her hands already knew what her mind was still negotiating. The door opened. The room was dark except for the glow of monitors, the ventilator hissing its mechanical breath, the fluid drip-drop of 4 lines that tasted like morphine and ignorance. She had 4 minutes maximum. Maybe 5 if Williams took the stairs instead of the elevator. Her hands moved. For port. Syringe. The fentanyl reduced from 8 micrograms per kilogram per hour to 4, her fingers working with the terrible grace of someone who'd done this in darkness with firefight around her. The norepinephrine was in the medication dispensary. She knew exactly where because she'd been watching this medication system for 72 hours, cataloging everything, planning for exactly this moment when the official channels had been sealed shut by a man more afraid of being questioned than interested in saving lives. She pushed the vasopressor into the secondary line. The monitor above the bed registered the change almost immediately, blood pressure climbing from 94 to 102. The irregular heartbeat beginning to stabilize, oxygen saturation creeping back toward 91%. Not fixed. But alive. Bought another 6 hours. Maybe 12. She was backing away from the bed when she saw him. Dr. Caldwell stood in the doorway, his presence filling it the way cold water fills a cup. He'd seen everything. His face held a particular kind of satisfaction, the look of a man who'd just watched his enemy hang herself. "You just ended your career," he said quietly, and his voice carried no anger, only certainty. "That's direct violation of a physician's standing orders. Unauthorized medication adjustment. Insubordination. I'm documenting everything." He pulled his phone from his pocket. "I'm calling the nursing director. Then the state licensing board. Then security." He smiled, actually smiled, as he walked toward the administrative offices to begin termination paperwork, his footsteps receding down the hallway like the closing of a door that wouldn't open again. The fluorescent lights hummed their electronic dirge above the hallway. Katie finished her shift at 2 o'clock in the morning, clocked out with Williams barely glancing at her, and drove 6 blocks from Seattle General in her 2008 Honda Civic through rain that hammered the windshield like judgment. She pulled into a diner called Mel's that stayed open 24 hours for hospital workers and insomniacs and people whose lives had just imploded. The coffee was terrible, burnt at the bottom of the pot, thin and bitter, and she ordered it anyway and sat in a booth by the window and watched her ghost face reflected in the glass at 3 o'clock in the morning, the rain streaming down the pane like tears from someone else's eyes. The tarnished challenge coin sat in her jacket pocket, the one artifact from her real life she'd allowed herself to keep. She pulled it out and turned it between her fingers, the weight of it familiar and strange at the same time, the metal worn soft from 16 years of other hands, other wars, other names. Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, 3 tours, carried through Marja with a bullet in her shoulder by a Special Forces commander who'd loved her enough to get her name permanently etched into his skin. And now she'd burned her cover and terminated her career and made it impossible to stay in the only position that mattered, close enough to protect him when he was helpless, close enough to be there when the real threats came. The extraction call would come in the morning. Someone from the Pentagon would make a phone call to someone at Seattle General, and the entire constructed life, the nursing credentials, the employment record, the references from schools she'd never attended, would evaporate like it had never existed. They would pull her out. They always did when covers burned. And Halifax would be left alone in that ICU bed with a cardiac rhythm that depended on a physician who saw him as an inconvenient liability, a man who'd loved her enough to mark his body with her name but wouldn't recognize her when they wheeled her away. She didn't know that 3 hours later, an emergency would wake Caldwell from his satisfied sleep. She didn't know that her medication adjustments would keep Halifax breathing when his heart decided to stop, that his survival would depend on a night shift resident brave enough to follow her protocols instead of his orders, that by dawn there would be people in dress uniforms asking very specific questions about why a naval commander was receiving substandard care in a civilian hospital. She only knew that at 3 in the morning, alone in Mel's diner, with her coffee going cold, that the impossible choice she'd made was the only choice that mattered. Some things were worth losing everything for. Some people were worth more than a cover that had taken years to build. She turned the challenge coin in the fluorescent light and waited for the morning that would change everything. The monitor screamed at 2:14 a.m. Not the steady alarm of a routine alert, the chaos of catastrophic failure. Ventricular fibrillation lit the screen in violent zigzags, blood pressure plummeting past 60, past 50, toward the flat line that meant death in minutes. Commander James Halifax's heart had simply stopped obeying the rules of biology, and 3 hallways away, Katie Rodriguez heard the code called over the overhead system and moved. She was off his care team. Caldwell had made sure of that. But her legs didn't care about chain of command, didn't process the termination papers she'd signed 6 hours earlier, didn't acknowledge the institutional walls meant to keep her out. Her body remembered priorities older than hospital policy, survival of the unit, protection of the commander, get to the casualty now. She ran. The ICU corridor blurred past antiseptic and fluorescent hum. Her boots, regulation nursing shoes, not combat boots, though her feet never quite accepted the downgrade, moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd run toward gunfire before. Muscle memory didn't distinguish between a desert compound under mortar fire and a hospital corridor under fluorescent lights. Casualty in distress. Move. That was the only equation that mattered. She hit the ICU bay at a sprint and stopped cold. Dr. Caldwell stood beside Halifax's bed with both hands trembling above the crash cart, staring at the monitor like it was displaying information in a language he'd never learned. The other nurses were performing protocol, pushing epinephrine, charging the defibrillator, running ACLS by the textbook, but Halifax's heart was in full fibrillation, unresponsive to electricity and medication. 30 seconds of no response. 45. Caldwell's face was the color of wet concrete, his jaw moving soundlessly, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't grip the defibrillator paddles. Katie didn't speak. She crossed the 3 feet of tile between the door and the bed and shoved him sideways with enough force that he stumbled into the supply cabinet, his shoulder striking metal with a sharp report that echoed through the bay. The other nurses gasped. Caldwell's mouth opened. Katie reached for the surgical tray, grabbed a scalpel, 14-gauge blade, clean steel, and made the cut. One motion. Decisive. Through skin and muscle and tissue. The sternum came next, hands that had learned in a field hospital outside Kandahar, in a compound where the electricity had failed and the generator had died and Commander Halifax's heart had stopped while she was the only one with steady enough hands to make it start again. She cracked his breastbone with her bare palms, feeling it give way like the spine of a closed book, opening him to the mechanics beneath. Blood welled up. She didn't flinch. Her hands, scarred from shrapnel and shaped by 16 years of reaching into bodies that didn't want to keep living, found Halifax's heart, a fist-sized organ that had forgotten how to beat, and her fingers closed around it. Cardiac massage. Not the textbook version through intact ribs. Direct compression. Her fingertips pressing against the myocardium itself, feeling the absence of rhythm, understanding through touch what the monitors were screaming. She began to pump. Steady. Methodical. 60 compressions a minute, the way the body remembered, the way a heart needed to be convinced that blood still mattered. The room had gone completely silent except for the monitors and the sound of her hands working. No one moved. The other nurses stood frozen, watching a nurse they knew, the quiet one Caldwell mocked, the one he'd ordered off the case, reach into a commander's open chest cavity and manually restore what machines couldn't. 30 seconds of direct compression. 60. She didn't think about contamination protocols or institutional liability or the fact that she was ending her own career with every squeeze of her fingers. She thought about Marja. She thought about 3 kilometers through hostile territory with Halifax bleeding out against her back. She thought about the moment his heart had stopped then, too, and the difference between letting him die and refusing to let him die. 90 seconds. 120. His heart spasmed under her fingers. Once. Twice. The rhythm shifted from chaos into order. The monitors caught it, a blip, then another, then a steady pattern resuming. The beat that meant life instead of death. Katie felt it happen beneath her hands before the machines announced it, that ancient communication between operator and organ, the language of survival. She withdrew her hands. Blood covered her forearms to the elbows, still warm, still alive. She stepped back from the bed without a word and walked to the sink, where she washed her hands with mechanical precision, soap, water, the routine so ingrained it felt like ritual. Behind her, the ICU burst into motion. The other nurses scrambled to stabilize him, to run labs, to begin the process of keeping alive what she'd just resurrected. They didn't speak to her. They didn't ask how she knew. They just worked around the blood on her scrubs as if she was a fixture, something that had always been there, something essential. Dr. Caldwell stared at her with his mouth open, his face transforming from grey to purple as the blood returned to his extremities. Rage replaced shock. Humiliation crystallized into something that looked like murder. Katie dried her hands on a paper towel, disposed of it with the same measured care she'd used disposing of a syringe, and walked past him toward the door. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't acknowledge the venom building in his expression. She simply moved through space the way she'd moved through hostile territory for 16 years, present, efficient, untouchable. By 6 a.m., Caldwell had activated every institutional weapon he possessed. For phone calls, each one stacking pressure on the institution like defensive fortifications. The hospital board president received a breakfast call about dangerous cowboy medicine and an authorized surgical intervention. A state licensing board investigator received an emergency request to review Katie's credentials and suspend her license pending investigation. The nursing director received explicit instructions to draft termination paperwork for gross violation of scope of practice. The Medical Oversight Committee received a formal complaint about reckless endangerment. He was competent at this, weaponizing policy, using hierarchy as a blade, understanding that institutions protected their own before they protected the outsider. The woman who'd saved Halifax's life twice was also the woman who'd violated every protocol in the institutional handbook. Both things were true. Only one of them mattered in writing. Katie signed the termination papers at 7 a.m. without reading them. The nursing director's hands were shaking as she slid them across the desk. "I'm sorry, Katie. I don't have a choice. It's an authorized surgical intervention. It's outside your scope. The board is already requesting your surrender of credentials." Katie nodded. She collected her belongings from her locker, the tarnished challenge coin, her phone, the single-framed photo she'd allowed herself, nothing more. 16 years of building a cover and 4 days of saving Commander Halifax's life had burned it all down. She'd known, watching him recover from that second cardiac massage, that extraction was the only path forward. But she'd also known she wasn't going to take it. She'd stayed. She'd watched him live. She destroyed her own position to keep him breathing. And by 7 a.m., none of it mattered because the institution had decided she was the problem. She walked out of Seattle General through the same doors she'd entered 3 weeks ago, the morning fog hanging over Philadelphia thick enough to muffle sound, thick enough to make the world seem smaller and safer than it actually was. Then, at 6:03 a.m. the following morning, 3 hours after Katie's termination papers had been finalized, the sound of diesel engines filled the parking lot. For Bradley fighting vehicles rolled up the circular drive, their treads scarring the decorative pavement, their exhaust mixing with the morning fog until the hospital looked like it was emerging from a war zone instead of a civilian medical facility. 2 military transport trucks followed behind, their paint schemes bearing insignia that made security guards straighten in their chairs. Boots descended from the vehicles. A lot of them. Men and women moving with the coordinated precision of a unit that had trained together, operated together, understood priorities that had nothing to do with hospital protocol. A gunnery sergeant in dress uniform, medals stacked on his chest like a resume written in ribbons, walked through the automatic doors and past security without stopping, heading directly for the nurse's station where the charge nurse, Rebecca Chen, was reviewing discharge paperwork. "I need to speak with Chief Rodriguez." Rebecca looked up. "I'm sorry, there's no." Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, the gunnery sergeant clarified, his voice parade ground loud, the kind of voice that carried to every corner of a room without shouting. "I need her location." The charge nurse's face went pale. "I don't think." The security desk at the information station, where Marcus Webb had worked for 12 years and watched Katie nod politely every time she passed, suddenly became the center of something larger. Marcus stood. His coffee cup clattered to the tile floor, coffee spreading across white ceramic, the sound cutting through the ambient hospital noise like a gunshot. "Master Chief Petty Officer," he said, and his voice cracked on every syllable. "Sir. I served under her command. Kandahar, 2019. She pulled my entire fire team out of an ambush en route Michigan. She saved every one of us." The lobby went still. Doctors paused mid-stride. Nurses abandoned their computers. Dr. Caldwell, arriving for morning rounds with his briefcase and his sense of institutional victory, felt the air pressure change the way animals feel pressure systems moving in from storms. A 2-star Army general emerged from the lead vehicle, boots striking tile with the sound of a gavel on a judge's bench. He carried a tablet, and his uniform carried the weight of commands that had moved thousands of people across continents. He stopped in the center of the atrium where the morning light came through the skylights, and he began to read. "Master Chief Petty Officer Katie and Rodriguez," the general said, his voice designed to carry 16 years of service with Naval Special Warfare Command. Bronze Star. He paused. People from the 5th floor were looking over the balconies now. Silver Star. Another pause. The silence in the atrium had become almost physical. 2 Purple Hearts awarded for wounds received in direct combat operations. He looked up, made eye contact with the crowd now assembling. And a Navy Cross awarded for extraordinary heroism in the Marja region of Helmand Province, Afghanistan, when she performed tactical field surgery on Commander James Halifax under enemy fire, refused direct orders to abandon him, and held defensive positions for 4 hours until extraction arrived. 150 people were listening now. Some were crying. Some were recording on their phones. Caldwell was pressed against the wall near the gift shop, his face the color of surgical gauze. The elevator opened. Halifax appeared in a wheelchair, moved by nursing staff, his body still recovering, his eyes still adjusting to consciousness. But his mind was clear. He wheeled himself forward, the chair moving with deliberate purpose, and he lifted the sleeve of his hospital gown. The tattoo was impossible to miss, Katie Rodriguez in capital letters, block style, with coordinates beneath it and a date. The date of Marja. The date she'd carried him out. She carried me 11 kilometers with a bullet in her shoulder, Halifax said, his voice rough but steady. I was unconscious. I was bleeding out. She performed surgery on me in a compound with no electricity and a pocket knife. Then she held off hostile forces for 4 hours until extraction arrived. He looked directly at Dr. Caldwell. I only live because this woman refused to put me down. I got her name tattooed so I'd never forget what real courage looks like. He turned to the general. 3 nights ago, my heart stopped in this hospital. My heart completely stopped. The monitors showed catastrophic failure. The doctors were frozen. His eyes found Caldwell's face. Master Chief Rodriguez cracked my chest open with her bare hands and manually restarted my heart. She saved my life twice. Once in Marja. Once here. 10 seconds of complete silence followed. Not the absence of sound, the presence of weight. The air itself seemed to hold meaning. Caldwell's phone buzzed in his pocket, once, twice, 3 times, but he didn't move to answer it. His hands were trembling again, the same tremor from 2 nights ago, but this time it was pure fear. At 6:03 a.m., the parking lot of Seattle General filled with a sound that made every person in the lobby freeze. Not sirens. Something worse. Diesel engines. Heavy ones. The kind that shook the building's foundation and made windows rattle in their frames. Through the glass doors, they appeared like a military funeral in motion, for Bradley fighting vehicles in perfect formation, their tread scarring the circular drive, 2 massive transport trucks rolling behind them with the deliberate speed of something that had nowhere to be but everywhere that mattered. Security guards who'd been standing idle suddenly straightened. Phones started ringing. No one moved to answer them. The gunnery sergeant emerged first, dress uniform so crisp it could cut, boots hitting the tile with a sound like a rifle bolt closing. He didn't walk around security. He walked past them. Past Dr. Caldwell, who'd positioned himself near the information desk like he owned the entire floor, whose face had already gone the color of old concrete. The sergeant's voice was low and precise, a voice that had called out grid coordinates under fire. I'm looking for Chief Rodriguez. Not Dr. Rodriguez. Not Nurse Rodriguez. Chief. The word hung in the atrium like a grenade with the pin pulled, and every person in that lobby understood in that moment that they'd been standing next to something they didn't recognize. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then a man in a silver security uniform stepped forward, mid-60s, weathered the way men get weathered when they've seen things that remake you from the inside, and his voice cracked like it hadn't in decades. Master Chief Petty Officer, sir. I served under her in Kandahar, Logar Province. She pulled my team out of a burning compound when command had written us off as lost. He swallowed hard. I'm honored to know her in any capacity. Security personnel who didn't know Katie looked at him like he'd just started speaking a language made of gunfire and blood. Around them, the hospital's fluorescent grid buzzed overhead, that sick electric hum that nobody notices until something stops their hearts. The two-star general stepped out of the lead Bradley, moving like water, finding its level, unhurried and absolutely certain. In his hands was a tablet, and he walked into the center of the atrium like he was walking into his own living room. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of someone who'd made decisions that ended wars and started them. For anyone who doesn't understand what just happened, I'm going to explain. He turned the tablet around, and his eyes found each face in the crowd, lingering just long enough to make sure they understood this was happening in front of them, not somewhere they could pretend not to know. Master Chief Rodriguez has spent 16 years in classified operations with the Naval Special Warfare Command. 16 years that her family didn't know about. 16 years that her medical records didn't reflect. 16 years that she carried alone. He lifted the tablet higher. On the screen, documents bearing seals that made people's breath catch. 3 Purple Hearts. Awarded for combat wounds in Marja, Helmand Province, and 2 other operations classified to the point where I can't tell you where or when without requiring everyone in this room to sign an NDA. The general's voice remained level, but each sentence landed like a fist. Navy Cross. Awarded for the extraction of Commander James Halifax from hostile territory, she carried him 11 kilometers through combat conditions with a 7.62 round through her shoulder that she didn't report until after the extraction was complete, because reporting it would have meant leaving him behind. He paused, and the silence that filled the space was so complete you could hear the rain starting outside, drumming the windows like Morse code. She was placed in this hospital under orders, using nursing credentials she earned while serving, to monitor the commander's recovery and protect him during a critical window where we had intelligence suggesting a security breach. Caldwell's face had gone from concrete gray to something closer to spoiled milk. His hands were in his pockets, and even from 10 feet away, you could see them trembling. The general wasn't done. The night Commander Halifax's heart stopped, Dr. Caldwell froze. 18 seconds of complete inaction while the patient was dying. Master Chief Rodriguez violated direct orders from her commanding officer, performed emergency direct cardiac massage, and kept this man alive. She did this despite being removed from his care team by someone whose professional jealousy exceeded his medical judgment. She did this despite being told explicitly not to intervene. She did this in the dark, with no one watching, because that's what she does. The general turned to look directly at Caldwell, and his eyes were the color of winter water. You nearly killed him 3 times with medication protocols that contradicted every dosing standard for trauma patients recovering from battlefield injuries. She corrected them. Every single time. Without any recognition. Without any expectation that the world would ever know her name. The lobby had gone so quiet you could hear the rain outside intensifying, hear the heart monitor from the ICU 3 floors above somehow, hear your own pulse if you were paying attention. The general set the tablet down on the information desk. Commander Halifax has asked to address you. What happened next happened in absolute silence. Halifax came down in a wheelchair. He was walking now with a cane, but for this moment, he'd chosen to come in the chair so every detail of his testimony would carry weight. His face was still pale from the infection that had nearly killed him, but his eyes were sharp, focused on one point in the crowd, and when he found Katie standing against the far wall in her scrubs, his hand went directly to his left forearm. He lifted his hospital gown sleeve and showed everyone what was there. Her name. Tattooed in permanent ink. Not Chief. Not Master Chief. Just her name, the way you tattoo the names of the dead you refuse to forget. She carried me out when she was shot, Halifax said, and his voice was steady, the voice of a man who'd made impossible decisions and lived with them. 11 kilometers. Through active engagement zones. With a bullet in her shoulder that she told nobody about. I only lived because she refused to put me down. I was tactical liability and she carried me anyway, and when she got me to the extraction point, the first thing she did was check my wounds instead of treating her own. He lowered his sleeve. That's who's been taking care of me in this hospital. A warrior. Dressed as a nurse. For people who don't deserve to shine her boots. The phones in Caldwell's pocket started ringing. All three of them, one after another, like something coordinated. He didn't answer. Watch them light up. The first message came through while everyone was watching, while the general was still standing in the center of the room, while the weight of 150 military personnel sitting in those vehicles outside pressed down like gravity itself. The screen showed a message from Dr. Raymond Mitchell, the man who'd hired him, who'd mentored him, who'd recommended him for the position at Seattle General. "You disgust me." Below it, a link. The link had a view count, 340,000 views. And climbing. The video was 27 seconds long. It showed the observation gallery, showed Caldwell's face, showed his mouth moving while those medical students snickered. This is what happens when nursing programs lower their standards. Some people simply don't have the intellectual capacity for complex medicine. The second message came from the hospital board president. Emergency review requested. Do not speak to press. The third came from the state medical board. Formal investigation opened. Effective immediately, your medical license is under review for competency assessment. The fourth, fifth, and sixth messages came in so fast his phone buzzed like it was malfunctioning. By 9 a.m., the video had 2 million views. Dr. Mitchell published an open letter in the Journal of Medical Ethics disavowing every decision Caldwell had made at Seattle General. By noon, 3 other patients came forward with their own stories: the dismissal of a nurse's concern that probably saved their life, the arrogance that made him ignore vital signs that contradicted his diagnosis, the institutional power he'd weaponized to silence people who questioned him. The nursing union filed a formal complaint. 2 board members who were veterans quietly submitted resignation letters, both containing the same phrase, "I cannot serve on a board that allows this." Caldwell sat alone in his office on the 15th floor, unable to leave through the front entrance where reporters had gathered like vultures waiting for something to die. He watched his career dissolve in real time on his phone screen, watched the comments section transform into a wildfire of professional judgment and personal recrimination, watched the future he'd carefully constructed evaporate into something worse than nothing, into visibility, into infamy, into the kind of permanent record that follows a man forever. By 3 p.m., the hospital had placed him on immediate administrative leave. By 6 p.m., his malpractice insurance had started asking questions. By 9 p.m., his wife had stopped answering his calls. 6 months later, Katie stood in dress blues in the Pentagon's main hall, her chest heavy with medals that had never been worn in public before, that had lived their entire lives in classified files and locked safes. Commander Halifax sat beside her in a wheelchair. He was walking now, genuinely, but for this ceremony he'd chosen the chair so he could sit next to her. The Secretary of the Navy stood at the podium, and his voice carried across a room of 200 military personnel and press. Master Chief Rodriguez spent 6 months undercover, her record hidden, her sacrifices mocked, all to protect a mission critical to national security. All to protect a brother who couldn't remember her face. Halifax reached over, found her hand, squeezed once. His left forearm rested on the chair arm where the cameras could see it. Where everyone could see her name. "We asked her to endure humiliation as part of her cover," the secretary continued. "We did not anticipate the cruelty she would face from people who had no idea who they were standing next to. For that failure, I apologize on behalf of the United States Navy." The tarnished challenge coin, the one she'd turned over in her fingers in that empty diner, the one that had been the only artifact of her real life she'd allowed herself to keep, was now polished to a mirror shine and mounted in a glass frame alongside her Navy cross. The engraving caught light, for those who refused to break. Her hands, the same hands that had performed cardiac massage and adjusted medication and saved a life in the darkness, held that frame steady while photographers captured the moment from every angle. After the ceremony, a reporter asked Katie what she'd say to Dr. Caldwell now. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that contains entire wars. Then, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." The reporter asked what she meant. Halifax answered for her, "It means she saved my life in the dark, when no one was watching. When there were no cameras or medals or recognition. She did it because it was right. That's the only kind of courage that matters." The camera shifted to show Dr. Caldwell, now teaching CPR certification at a community college 2 states away, earning $18 an hour to a bored class of 20 people who didn't know his name and wouldn't have cared if they did. On the wall behind him, a poster read, "Excellence in Healthcare." He didn't look at it anymore. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in power, if you've ever kept quiet while someone diminished your work, subscribe to see the stories of people who didn't stay quiet. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to know that the quietest person in the room is often the one holding it all together. And comment, what would you have done in Katie's position?